Victor had been doting on Grace for over 20 years. She always thought it was only natural they'd end up together, get married, have kids, and live happily ever after. But then Victor brought home another girl and introduced her, saying, "Gracie, meet your sister-in-law. Oliver, I've decided. I'm heading to Europe to pursue my career." On the other end of the line, Oliver's voice was brimming with excitement. "It's about time. With your talent, if you'd gone earlier, you'd already be an internationally renowned photographer by now." Grace let out a polite laugh. "Thank you for the compliment, Oliver. So when can you make it here? I recently ran into a few fashion magazine editors in Milan. They're really interested in your work and would love to meet you." Grace thought for a moment before replying, "Probably in about 2 weeks. I need to wrap up some things here first." "That works. Your brother dotes on you so much. I'm sure he'll fuss over you heading abroad alone. Make sure you have a good talk with him." After hanging up the phone, Grace's gaze wandered to the woman not far away, trying on wedding dresses, and the man standing beside her with a soft smile. She let out a bitter chuckle. Victor had always cherished her. Even Margaret used to tease him, saying, "What kind of brother sticks to his sister like glue all the time? People are going to get the wrong idea." Victor raised an eyebrow. "The wrong idea about what?" "That you're not siblings but a couple." Victor, with the same gentle smile as now, had looked at her tenderly and replied, "Then let them think that." At the time, Grace had been startled, maybe even a little flustered. But when her eyes met Victor's warm, earnest gaze, her cheeks had turned a soft shade of pink. People live in fleeting moments. And that moment became the sweetest memory of Grace's life. She'd been waiting for Victor to break through that invisible barrier between them. She was ready to say yes without hesitation when he did. But she waited and waited, only to find his eyes had begun to focus on someone else. Lily was his secretary. Back then, Victor had placed several resumes in front of Grace, saying, "Gracie, pick one for me." Grace hesitated. "I don't really know much about this. Maybe you should let HR handle it." But Victor insisted, "My secretary will probably be around you a lot in the future. Pick someone you like, so you'll feel comfortable interacting with her." Grace ended up choosing Lily to be Victor's secretary. What she hadn't realized was that she wasn't just choosing a secretary. She was choosing her own sister-in-law. "Gracie!" Lily's excited voice called out from across the room. "Come here and check this out. What do you think of this wedding dress? Your brother is so unhelpful. He says I look good in everything and won't give a single opinion." Grace sighed and said, "It's your wedding dress. As long as you like it, that's all that matters." Lily pouted, her tone taking on a playful whine. "But, Gracie, you know I didn't come from a privileged background. I'm afraid my taste isn't sophisticated enough and might embarrass your brother. You, on the other hand, are a renowned photographer with an impeccable eye. I'm only good at photography. I can spot a good composition, but I really don't know much about wedding dresses." Lily's expression dimmed, her voice tinged with a trace of disappointment. "Gracie, are you still not okay with me?" Grace opened her mouth to explain, but no words came out. It wasn't that she couldn't accept Lily. She just couldn't understand how Victor, who had once treated her like she was his entire world, had fallen for someone else so suddenly. "Vic, I think Gracie's still upset with me about what happened last time. Could you go talk to her?" Lily said softly. Victor's voice was calm but firm. "She's not upset. If it's because I misunderstood her last time, we can postpone the wedding. We'll wait until she's ready to give us her blessing." Victor frowned slightly. "We're not postponing the wedding just because of that. But she's your sister. I want her to be happy for us." Victor paused before finally turning and walking toward Grace. His tone was distant, almost cold. "Still upset about what happened?" Grace turned her face away. "I'm not. You hugged me out of nowhere last time. It's no wonder Lily misunderstood. Gracie, you're an adult now. You should know better. Grace's eyes stung as she looked at the faintly reproachful expression on Victor's face. When Victor used to dote on her, he was always the one sticking close to her. If there were other people around and she tried to put some distance between them, he'd pull her right back to his side, visibly unhappy. When she went to the countryside to photograph landscapes, he followed. When she traveled to Africa to capture the Great Migration, he was there too. He had always told her that no matter where or when, he would always have her back. All she had to do was turn around and he'd be there. That day when her photography had won an international gold medal, she had instinctively hugged him, eager to share her joy with him. But Lily had walked in without knocking and saw the scene. From that moment on, Victor had grown cold. He avoided Grace whenever possible, his warmth replaced with a frost she couldn't thaw. Grace took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. I'm sorry. Last time, I didn't handle things properly and caused a misunderstanding with your sister-in-law. I promise to be more careful in the future and won't let it happen again. Victor nodded slightly. It's good that you realize your mistake. Grace responded with a soft then added, you two can continue looking at wedding dresses. I'm not feeling well, so I'll head out. As she turned and left the bridal shop, tears, unbidden and unwelcome, began to stream down her face. She wiped them away hastily with the back of her hand, then pulled out her phone and booked a plane ticket. In just 2 weeks, she would board that flight and leave this place for good. Leave Victor. Grace stayed out until the early hours of the morning before returning home. The decision to leave had been made in a single fleeting moment, but over 20 years of emotions were not so easily discarded. She wasn't strong enough to truly let go as if it were nothing. To avoid second-guessing herself, she resolved to limit her interactions with Victor over the next 2 weeks as much as possible. When she returned to the mansion, the house was cloaked in darkness. She didn't bother turning on the lights and dragged her exhausted body toward her bedroom. But just as she reached the living room, a voice stopped her in her tracks. Grace. She turned to see someone sitting on the sofa. Do you need something, Miss Lily? Lily was draped in a black lace slip dress, lounging seductively against the armrest of the sofa with a faint smile. Victor bought this for me. What do you think? Does it look good? As she straightened her posture, the faint red marks on her chest and waist became more apparent, their contrast against the black lace making them all the more provocative. Lily lightly touched the red marks on her neck, letting out a theatrical little ow as if in pain. Her voice was syrupy as she complained, Your brother has no taste in wedding dresses, but he sure knows how to pick lingerie. He said he couldn't resist me when I wore this. Standing on the staircase, Grace looked down at her coldly, a faint smirk of derision curving her lips. Lily, tone it down. Tone what down? The stench. Lily burst out laughing. But that's exactly what your brother likes, the stench. The moment he came home, he couldn't wait to see me in this slip dress. And then, you don't need to say another word. I don't want to hear it. Whether you want to hear it or not, it's the truth. He's obsessed with my body. 20 years of affection? What does that even matter? Men will always choose the one who excites them in bed. Grace had no intention of engaging with her further. Turning, she said, Keep performing your little play. I'm not interested in being your audience. But Lily wasn't about to let her go so easily. Gathering up her dress, she chased after Grace. You're too far away to see the marks your brother left on me, aren't you? Grace, don't go. Come closer, take a good look. As she spoke, Lily caught up and grabbed Grace's arm. Grace felt a nauseating wave rise in her stomach and instinctively pulled away. Don't touch me. At that moment, Victor emerged from his bedroom, his voice calm but firm. What are you two talking about this late at night? Grace opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Lily's expression shifted dramatically, from smug to terrified in an instant. Then came the scream. Ah! Lily tumbled down the stairs. Lily! Victor dropped the glass of milk he was holding and rushed over, cradling Lily in his arms. Are you okay? Lily lay weakly against him, her voice soft and pitiful. I'm fine. Don't blame Gracie. She didn't mean it. Victor looked up at Grace, his eyes filled with disappointment. Grace, no matter how much you dislike Lily, you shouldn't have pushed her down the stairs. Do you have any idea how dangerous that was? When he turned back to Lily, his voice was filled with gentle concern. He leaned down to lift her carefully into his arms. Let's go back to the bedroom so I can check if you're hurt. Lily's cheeks flushed. In the future, let's try not to be so affectionate in front of Gracie. It's normal for a younger sister to feel possessive of her brother. You used to spoil her exclusively, and now she suddenly has to share. It's only natural she'd find it hard to adjust. We need to be more understanding and give her time to get used to it. Victor's tone was cold. She'll have to get used to it eventually. With that, he carried Lily back to the bedroom. Over his shoulder, Lily glanced back at Grace and flashed a triumphant peace sign. Grace suddenly felt as though the world around her had become unrecognizable. Lily's arrival had shattered her world into pieces. She couldn't understand why Victor would fall for someone like Lily. Was it really as Lily had said? That when it came to love versus desire, people always chose the thrill of the latter. Grace didn't know. And now she didn't want to know anymore. The next morning, Grace made a trip to the magazine office. She had been working there as a column photographer for 3 years and had built great relationships with her colleagues. The editor-in-chief was surprised to receive her resignation letter. Is it because of the salary? You can bring it up directly. I'll discuss it with the president. Grace smiled and shook her head. Thank you, chief editor, but it's not because of the salary. Then what is it? I have other plans for my life. Hearing this, the chief editor immediately understood, her smile deepening. Ah, so you're preparing to marry Victor and become Mrs. Ho. It makes sense. Over the years he's been picking you up and dropping you off every single day, rain or shine. He obviously treasures you. If you're marrying him, that's a good thing. I won't try to stop you. Grace wanted to explain when she heard the first part of the sentence. Victor was indeed getting married, but not to her. But by the time the chief editor finished speaking, Grace no longer felt the urge to clarify. The entanglement between her, Victor, and Lily was far too complicated to explain in a sentence or two. All she wanted now was to quickly finalize her resignation, leave her job, and escape this place that had brought her so much heartache. Oh, by the way, Grace, when's the wedding? Be sure to send me an invitation so I can have a drink at your celebration. Grace forced an awkward smile. Just then, the front desk receptionist, Xiao Wang, knocked excitedly on the door and peeked her head in. Grace, your boyfriend's here to pick you up again. He's got a surprise for you today. When Grace stepped out of the magazine's office, she saw Victor leaning against his black Cullinan, deep in thought. As she moved closer, she finally saw what Xiao Wang had referred to as the surprise. The vehicle's interior was filled with roses, vibrant, crimson red, and bursting with life. The passenger seat was the sole exception. The back seats and trunk were overflowing with the fragrant blooms. Behind her, Grace could still hear a few of her female colleagues, those she got along well with, giggling and whispering. They huddled behind the office sign, sneaking glances and nudging each other playfully. Victor often came to pick her up, sometimes bringing along little things she liked, cupcakes, bubble tea, or her favorite snacks. Her colleagues had grown used to it, yet they still teased her every time. Whenever your boyfriend shows up, the whole office gets treats. We're all riding on Gracie's coattails. Grace used to let them joke about it, smiling it off and sharing whatever Victor brought with everyone. Today, though, they were probably waiting to divvy up the roses in his car. She called out, "Victor." Victor looked up, but his expression was grim. His tone remained cold. Don't just call me by my name. Call me brother. Grace froze for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, brother. About last night I spoke too harshly. Don't take it to heart. Okay. But you're not a child anymore. Pushing someone down the stairs is dangerous. Don't ever do something like that again. Grace looked up at him incredulous. She let out a disbelieving laugh. So you came all the way here today to accuse me? Victor's face darkened. Do you still not realize you were wrong? Victor, you've known me for over 20 years. If I really wanted to hurt her, I wouldn't be stupid enough to do it in my own home. Grace raised her voice, her anger boiling over. But as soon as the words left her mouth, she regretted them. It didn't matter anymore. She was leaving anyway. No amount of explanation would make a difference now. Forget it. Just go. Stop disrupting my work. When Grace returned to the office entrance, her colleagues, who had just been laughing and joking, noticed something was wrong. Their expressions shifted to concern. Grace, did you two have a fight? Don't be mad. Look, he even brought all those roses to make up. Give him a chance. Yeah, Grace, you don't know how lucky you are. A boyfriend as good as him is hard to find. Grace's face was blank as she said quietly, Stop standing around here. Get back to work. Her photography skills made her a respected figure in the office. The younger staff, though reluctant, obeyed her, shuffling back to their desks with downcast faces. Xiao Wang, who was closest to her, tugged at her sleeve and whispered, Grace, can I ask him for a rose? I saw his car. It's packed with flowers and he even brought vases. Grace sighed, exasperated. I'll buy you some flowers later. Your vase won't stay empty, I promise. Back at her desk, she struggled to focus. She forced herself to work on a few photos she had taken earlier, but her thoughts were a chaotic mess. Her phone buzzed. Image. 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 Which one do you like? Blushing emoji. Lily had sent her several pictures of lingerie. Not exactly lingerie, but more like provocative nightwear. They were revealing in all the places they shouldn't be, leaving little to the imagination. Soon after, the messages were deleted. Lily. Oh, sorry. Sent to the wrong person. Grace turned off her phone and threw it into her desk drawer. Both she and Lily knew perfectly well that the message had been no accident. Lily had sent it to her on purpose. Grace didn't retrieve her phone from the drawer until the end of the workday. She powered it on. No missed calls. No text messages. No WeChat notifications. Nothing. There was a time when, if she went more than 30 minutes without responding, Victor would blow up her phone with calls and messages, or even storm into her office at the magazine to find her. But now? Nothing. Her WeChat moments, however, pinged with a notification. Someone had posted an update. She opened it and was greeted by a familiar scene. The interior of a classic black Cullinan, brimming with vibrant red roses. Lily stood in front of the car, cradling a bouquet of roses in her arms, a blissful smile lighting up her face. The caption read, Asterisk, thank you, my love. This is the best birthday gift I've ever received. Asterisk. Oh, it was Lily's birthday today. So, the things in his car these days were all for Lily. After work, Grace found herself reluctant to go home. But Margaret called her, sounding concerned. Gracie, why are you staying late at the office every day lately? It's not safe for a young woman to be out so late. Let me ask Vic to come pick you up. I don't want to ride in his car anymore, Grace thought bitterly. Neither the passenger seat nor the roses were meant for her. No need, Margaret. I'll take a cab home. All right then, but be careful, okay? Grace hailed a cab and returned home. When she walked through the door, Victor and Lily were both there. Lily was dragging a large suitcase and had just stepped out of her room. Gracie, you're back. Lily greeted her with a sugary smile. Grace's temper flared instantly. Who gave you permission to go into my room? Victor, overhearing, slammed his glass down on the table. I did. What about it? You had no right. You can't just go into my room and touch my things without asking. Grace, this is the Hua family home. Lily is my fiancée. She can go into any room she wants in this house. It felt like a bucket of icy water had been dumped over Grace. Lily, ever so gentle, chided Victor softly. Vic, you shouldn't talk to Gracie like that. You'll hurt her feelings. Then she turned to Grace, her tone sweet and conciliatory. Gracie, I only went in because the household staff mentioned that Victor's clothes and shoes were still in your wardrobe. You know how us girls have so many clothes, we need all the closet space we can get. So I thought I'd help out by moving his things into our bedroom. Victor had clung to her so tightly back then. Growing up, Grace had never once received a love letter. Not one. Victor had seen to that. Later, he'd simply moved his clothes into her room outright, under the pretense that it would make his mornings easier if she picked out his outfit and tie for him. She knew where every piece of his wardrobe was better than he did. Now, rushing upstairs, she pushed open the door to her room and froze. The chaos inside made it look like a hurricane had ripped through the space. Her clothes, shoes, and makeup were scattered everywhere. A complete and utter mess. Pointing at the disaster, Grace demanded furiously, "Is this what you call helping?" Lily's eyes immediately filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Gracie. It was an accident." An accident? Turning my room into a war zone? That's quite the accident, wouldn't you say? Victor, hearing the commotion, frowned and barked. Grace, watch your tone. Grace laughed bitterly. So once again, I'm the one at fault even though I've done nothing wrong? Is that it? Lily is your future sister-in-law. You should show her some respect. Victor, why don't you come up here and see for yourself? Victor climbed the stairs, and for a fleeting moment, his brows furrowed at the sight of the disarray. But just for a moment. In the next second, he turned to Lily, his face softening with indulgence. He chuckled lightly. Let's leave the cleaning to the staff from now on, all right? But I don't want anyone else touching my clothes. Lily pouted, her cheeks tinged pink. Especially my nightwear. She emphasized the word nightwear, her face flushing deeper. Victor smiled helplessly and nodded. All right then. I'll take care of it myself next time. You can just sit and relax, okay? Lily stuck out her tongue playfully. Vic, am I being a bit silly? No worries. With me here, you can be as silly as you want. Grace closed her eyes briefly, trying to suppress the wave of nausea rising within her. She had never hated the idea of a work resignation notice period more than she did now. If not for that, she'd already be halfway across the ocean, far away from this mess. Grace, Victor said, his tone impatient. Take account of how many clothes and items Lily damaged. Give me the total, and I'll compensate you. Grace let out a bitter laugh. Victor Hua, throwing money at a problem to make it go away. And the person he was dismissing this time was her. Lily leaned in slightly, her voice low as she touched Grace's arm. Gracie, you can exaggerate the amount a little if you want. With me here, whatever you ask for, he'll have to give it to you. Victor's voice softened as he looked at Lily. You really are siding with her, aren't you? Teaming up with an outsider to bleed me dry. Lily stuck her tongue out playfully. From now on, I'll be Gracie's sister-in-law. And as the eldest sister-in-law, I'm practically her second mother. Of course, I'll take her side. Grace responded with a cold laugh, turning her back on her own. An outsider. Yes, that's what they were now, the closest people in each other's lives. And she? A foster child of the Hawthorne family. She was undeniably just an outsider. The phone rang abruptly. It was Oliver. Grace composed herself before answering. Mr. Oliver? Oliver's voice came through steady and professional. Grace, I remember the bird photography series you shot some time ago. It was excellent. The editor at the magazine wants to take a look. Could you send me the negatives again? Of course, Mr. Oliver. Please hold on for a moment. Grace walked into her bedroom. She preferred film cameras, and all her negatives were stored in a small locked drawer. Instinctively, she reached for the key, but as soon as her hand touched the cabinet, she noticed it was damp. The entire thing felt wet. Gracie, I'm so sorry. I accidentally spilled coffee earlier, and I was worried it might stain your cabinet. So I gave it a thorough rinse with water. The more Lily spoke, the colder Grace's heart grew. Without wasting another word on Lily, she swiftly unlocked the drawer. The moment she pulled it open, her last shred of hope was crushed. Rows upon rows of negatives were soaked through. Some had already unraveled, others were discolored, and many were tangled into a chaotic mess. The water in the drawer had turned a murky brown. These were the negatives of every photograph she had taken over the past 3 years. All destroyed. Grace's hands trembled with rage. She was so furious that words failed her. Victor entered the room at some point. His gaze swept over the disaster in the drawer, but his tone remained indifferent. Add up the cost of the films. Whatever the total is, I'll cover it along with Lily. Grace finally exploded. Can she even afford to pay? Do you have any idea what those films meant to me? Do you? Victor's brows furrowed slightly. I understand you're upset, but the films are already ruined. Losing your temper won't change that, will it? Lily had good intentions. She was trying to help me pack and made an innocent mistake with the coffee. Innocent mistake? So that's it? You can just wave it off? If someone accidentally killed someone with a car, could they just say sorry and be done with it? Grace. Victor's voice grew sharp. Stop being unreasonable. Films and human lives are not the same. You can always reshoot the photos. Is it really that serious? On the phone, Oliver's voice carried a note of concern. Grace, is everything all right? Did something happen at home? Grace exhaled deeply, trying to suppress her emotions. Mr. Oliver, I'm afraid I can't send you the negatives right now. I'll find time to reshoot the photos and send them over later. Take your time. We'll need at least 2 weeks to process the visa. Understood. Victor's ears perked up at a particular word. Visa? Are you leaving the country? Grace hung up the phone. She forced herself to calm down and began cleaning up the mess on the floor. Mr. Oliver's visa has expired. Since he's elderly and traveling back and forth would be a hassle, he asked me to help him sort it out. Victor's tone carried suspicion. Doesn't Mr. Oliver have a daughter here? Why wouldn't she handle it? Grace shot him an irritated look. Why don't you call her and ask? I don't have the time for that. Then stop asking so many questions. It took Grace the entire night to clean her room. As for the clothes and shoes Lily had muddied and scattered around, Grace decided not to bother taking them. She tossed them all into a corner of the closet. She managed to salvage a few film rolls, but the water had left the negatives severely damaged and unusable. Her makeup collection hadn't fared any better. The liquid products had leaked, the powders were ruined, and nothing was salvageable. Then came Lily's message. Lily, just a little warning for today. Grace saw the message linger for exactly 2 minutes before it was retracted. 2 minutes, just enough time for her to read it, but not enough to leave evidence. But Grace had learned her lesson from last time. She immediately took a screenshot of the message. With a cold smile, she sent the screenshot back to Lily. This time Lily was silent for a long while. Grace couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Did Lily really think her schemes would succeed over and over again without Grace catching on? How naive. About 10 minutes later, Lily finally replied. Lily, what do you mean by this? Grace, nothing. Just a warning of my own. Hitting send, she powered off her phone. Let Lily do whatever she pleased, retract the messages or not. Grace no longer cared how Victor might react after seeing them. From the moment she decided to leave, She knew she could no longer place any hope in him. The next morning during breakfast, Margaret noticed Grace's pale complexion and asked with concern, "Gracie, did you not sleep at all last night? You look unwell." Grace responded with a faint "I didn't sleep well, but it's okay. A few days of rest will fix it." Margaret nodded empathetically. "Yes, you need to take care of yourself these days. After all, you'll be busy with Vic's wedding soon." Grace's head lifted slightly. "They've set a date for the wedding?" "Yes, it's next weekend. Didn't Vic tell you? That boy used to tell you every little thing. Now he's getting married and hasn't even mentioned it?" "Really? Next weekend?" Grace glanced at the calendar. That date coincided exactly with the day she planned to leave. Just then Victor and Lily walked out of the bedroom. Lily, acting as if nothing had happened, beamed and greeted Grace cheerfully. "Gracie, I've already talked it over with Vic. You're going to be our chief photographer for the wedding. You have to make me look stunning." Grace's rejection was immediate. "I can't. I have plans that day." Lily pouted, her voice tinged with grievance. "Are you still upset about yesterday? I'm really sorry, okay? If you're still mad, I'll kneel down and apologize." As she spoke, Lily bent her knees slightly as if about to kneel. Victor pulled her back up in one swift motion. "She's not worth you kneeling for," he said coldly. Margaret, sensing the tension, quickly stepped in to mediate. "Lily, there's no need for that. Gracie treasures her film roles more than anything. Sure, she's upset, but it's not worth kneeling over." Lily's voice quivered with remorse. "I just feel like I can't do anything right. I'm so sorry, Gracie." Victor consoled her gently. "Just be more careful next time. Let's eat now. You were saying earlier how hungry you were." Lily playfully stuck out her tongue. "Well, that's because of you. If you hadn't been so clingy this morning, I wouldn't be this tired and hungry." Fine, it's all my fault. Now sit down and eat." Victor pulled out a chair for Lily, ensuring she was seated comfortably. He even tied a napkin around her neck with care. Only after settling Lily did he take a seat beside her. As he spread jam on a slice of toast, he said casually, "Grace, next weekend at the wedding, whatever plans you have, cancel them. You're our photographer. It's the least we can do to honor over 20 years of being like siblings." Before Grace could respond, the doorbell rang. The housekeeper answered the door to find an unfamiliar middle-aged woman standing there. "Who are you looking for?" The visitor smiled warmly. "Hello, is Miss Grace here? I'm from a charity organization. She reached out to us about donating some clothes to children in remote mountain areas. We agreed I'd come by today to pick them up." Grace immediately stood. "That's me. The clothes are packed upstairs. Please wait a moment." She went up to her room and returned with several large bags filled with clothes. She handed them to the woman. The woman expressed heartfelt gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Grace, for your generosity. It's getting colder, and many girls in the mountains don't have enough clothes for the winter. These donations will make a big difference." "It's nothing," Grace replied with a faint smile. "Please make sure they get to them as soon as possible." "Of course. You don't need to worry." "Wait," Victor interrupted, walking over with a puzzled expression. He looked down at the 6 or 7 large bags of clothes on the floor, his brows knitting together. "You're donating all of your clothes?" Margaret, equally surprised, joined in. "Gracie, even if you want to do something charitable, we could have just donated money. Why give away all your clothes? It's getting cold, what will you wear?" Grace looked at Victor, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Didn't you say you'd compensate me for Lily's mistake? These clothes are old and I don't want them anymore. With the money I can buy new ones. Is that not okay?" Victor stared at her for a moment before nodding. "Fine. How much do you want? I'll transfer it now." Grace raised a single finger. Victor's eyes narrowed. 1 million? Sure. No. 10 million. Lily's voice shot up in panic. How can a few pieces of clothing be worth 10 million? Grace cast her a cold glance before turning back to Victor. $1. These clothes were all things Victor had insisted on buying for her in the past. Now that she had decided to leave, she didn't want to take anything that belonged to him. Not his clothes, not his money. As Victor himself had said, this was the Ho family's home. She was just an outsider. $1. A clean break. 20 years of emotions wiped out with a single stroke. Victor's patience began to wear thin. Grace, what are you trying to do? Are you giving it or not? If you are, transfer it now. If not, forget it. There was a long pause before Victor finally relented and transferred the money. He said, I've fulfilled my promise. Consider this matter settled. From now on, don't give Lily the cold shoulder over this. Grace glanced at her bank account, where the $1 had just been deposited. A faint smile curved her lips. Don't worry. I never will again. And one more thing, Victor added, his tone firm. You're coming to the wedding as our photographer. It's Lily's wish and you must be there. Grace hesitated for a moment. Her flight was scheduled for that evening. Their wedding night. Sure, she nodded. I can do that. The days that followed, Grace hardly went back to the Victor household. She visited the countryside, snapping a fresh series of bird photos, which she then sent to Oliver. When Oliver saw them, he was thrilled. He immediately started a video call with her. Grace, your composition and use of color have improved so much. Several magazines here are scrambling to feature your work. When you get here, we'll meet them all and pick the best one together. Receiving such high praise, Grace beamed. Thank you so much, Oliver. By the way, have you talked to your brother? Is he okay with your plans to stay in Europe? Grace chuckled. He's actually really supportive about it. That's great. No obstacles then. Honestly, I was bracing myself for a tough time convincing him. Grace asked Oliver for his address and shipped her photography equipment ahead of her trip. He agreed to hold on to it until she arrived and could pick it up from his home. On the day of Victor and Lily's wedding, Grace borrowed a camera from the wedding planners. Lily, now living her dream of marrying into wealth, couldn't hide her smugness. Especially during the photo shoot, she radiated the air of a triumphant winner. Victor, busy mingling with guests, was soon dragged back by Lily, who insisted he pose with her for the photos. Margaret, ever protective of Grace, intervened. Lily, you've already taken so many. Let Gracie have a break, all right? But Lily countered. Gracie's so talented. How could this little bit tire her out? Right, Gracie? Margaret didn't hide her displeasure. I'll have the wedding photographer take over. Gracie needs to rest. But the wedding photographers can't compare to Gracie. This is a once-in-a-lifetime day for Victor and me. We need Gracie to capture our happiest moments. Grace stayed quiet, snapping the final shot before handing the camera back to the wedding team. Without another word, she turned and left. Margaret caught up to her. Gracie, where are you going? Grace smiled gently. Margaret, Victor has Lily to look after him now. You should take care of yourself too. You silly child, you'll always be my daughter. Don't forget that. Grace held Margaret's hand, her smile soft but unwavering. I will always be your daughter. Margaret sighed sentimentally. Gracie once. I really thought you'd end up as my daughter-in-law, calling me Mom. Who would have thought Victor would suddenly? Margaret, Grace interrupted with a light laugh. Let's not go there. All right. No more of that. Her phone rang. It was Oliver. Grace, are you at the airport yet? What time do you land? Rose and I will pick you up. Almost there. Great. See you in 8 hours. See you. Ending the call, she checked the time. It was about time to head out. Grace didn't even stop by the Victor house. She went straight to the airport. While waiting in line to board, a message from Lily popped up. Lily, Thanks so much for personally taking photos of Victor and me. We both love them. From now on, don't forget to call me your sister-in-law. Lily. Looking forward to us getting along, little sister. Victory. Grace scoffed, taking a screenshot. Without any hesitation, she sent it straight to Victor. Grace. Congrats on your wedding, bro. Here's to never seeing each other again. Then she blocked both Victor and Lily. From that moment on, they were erased from her world. A flight attendant greeted her with a bright smile. Miss, have a pleasant flight. Grace returned the smile, polite but radiant. Thank you. I'm sure I will. And with that, she boarded, not once looking back. When the plane touched down at Milan Airport, Grace felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as though a heavy weight had finally been lifted. Oliver had mentioned picking her up with Rose, but as she scanned the arrivals area, she noticed someone else with them. Grace, over here. Grace walked over, her face lighting up. She gave Rose a hug first. Rose, you still look as young and beautiful as ever. Then she waved playfully at Oliver. Oliver, if you don't start taking better care of yourself, you're going to look way too old to match your gorgeous wife. Oliver laughed heartily. You little rascal. It's been years, and the first thing you do is roast me. What? I wasn't roasting you. That was a compliment. With that beard of yours, you look like a seasoned photographer. You could be the next Max Rive. Oliver chuckled and pretended to scold her. All right, enough out of you. You've been spoiled by your brother, haven't you? No respect for your elders. Speaking of Victor, Rose asked, did you come by yourself? Your brother didn't come to see you off. Oliver glanced behind her. Is he getting the luggage? You're empty-handed. Someone must have come to help, right? Grace hooked one arm around Oliver and the other around Rose, practically dragging them along. I'm an adult now, okay? I don't need anyone to escort me. I flew here all by myself. Oliver, Rose, let's go already. I'm starving. Neither Oliver nor Rose seemed to notice anything unusual, and simply walked with her toward the exit. But the other person who had come along wasn't about to let it go that easily. He took a few quick steps after them. Grace. Oliver suddenly snapped his fingers, as if remembering something, and laughed. Oh, my memory. I left the driver behind. Grace had already noticed him the moment she stepped out of the airport. The guy looked to be about 30, with broad shoulders and a tall, striking frame. He had a calm, refined vibe, wearing a gray sweater jacket that gave him an approachable, gentle appearance. Oliver introduced him with a smile. Grace, this is your senior, Seth. Do you remember him? Grace racked her brain for a moment before shaking her head in confusion. Sorry. Seth? Were you one of Oliver's students too? Oliver burst out laughing. You really don't remember anything, do you? Grace still looked completely lost. Seth's face flushed slightly, and he seemed a little awkward. Oliver, can we not bring up the past? Spare me some dignity. Oliver laughed even harder. All right, I won't bring it up. Or maybe you should find a chance to tell her yourself. Seth looked even more embarrassed and quickly made an excuse to leave. I'll go get the car. Wait for me at the entrance. I'll be quick. Grace watched him walk away, still utterly baffled. It wasn't until Rose caught Grace's puzzled expression and decided to clue her in. Gracie, do you remember when you were in college and delivered a love letter to a guy? Grace. Oh, she remembered all right. It had been a massive misunderstanding. The love letter wasn't hers. She was just delivering it for her shy roommate, who had a huge crush on one of the seniors but was too scared to confess. Grace, being Grace, couldn't stand by and do nothing. She volunteered herself as the unofficial matchmaker, the Cupid with a mission. She had finally found the perfect opportunity to deliver the letter, catching the guy outside the sketching building. Just as she was about to explain the situation, a group of nosy boys nearby snatched the letter from his hands and read it out loud for everyone to hear. Now, love letters typically contain sweet, heartfelt sentiments. But Grace hadn't seen this one in advance, and it turned out her usually timid-as-a-mouse roommate had written something bold. The first line read, asterisk, your fly is down, asterisk. The second line, asterisk, looks impressive though, asterisk. Grace had been mortified, frozen like a statue on the spot. The poor guy being confessed to looked equally stunned, caught between embarrassment and confusion. He kept apologizing to her before rushing off to chase down his troublemaking friends. The fallout was epic. The letter's contents were so outrageous that Grace became an overnight sensation on campus. But Vic hadn't found it funny at all. No matter how many times Grace explained that the letter wasn't hers, that she didn't have a crush on the guy, and that it was all just one big mistake, Vic was furious. And when Vic got angry, the consequences were serious. Somehow, Vic managed to pull some strings and got the senior sent abroad on a so-called exchange program. Officially, it was a prestigious opportunity. Unofficially, it was a clean break from Grace's world. Grace had felt guilty about it for a while. Not only had the senior been shipped off, but her roommate's budding romance had been cut short before it even began. For Grace, the whole mess had ended with her and Vic in a long drawn-out Cold War. Back at the airport, Seth soon pulled up in a car. He rolled down the window and called out, Oliver, Rose, and Grace. Hop in. Oliver and Rose, being the inseparable couple they were, naturally slid into the back seat together, leaving Grace with only one option, the front passenger seat. She stood outside the car for a moment, hesitating. Seth noticed and asked, Grace, why aren't you getting in? After a pause, she asked, Seth, do you have a girlfriend? Her question landed like a bombshell, leaving everyone, including Oliver and Rose, momentarily stunned. Rose covered her mouth, stifling a laugh, and exchanged a knowing look with Oliver. Her expression practically screamed, there's potential here. Oliver caught on immediately and smirked, his gaze full of meaning. Even Seth seemed taken aback, unsure of what to make of her question. Grace explained matter-of-factly, the front passenger seat is kind of a big deal for any girl. If you have a girlfriend, I don't mind squeezing into the back with Oliver and Rose. Seth quickly waved his hand. No girlfriend. You're good, sit up front. Only then did Grace climb into the car. As they drove off, Rose turned to Grace with a gentle smile. Gracie, you don't have to be so formal. You and Seth aren't strangers after all. Grace replied politely, even if we're not strangers as adults, we still need to maintain proper boundaries. This was a vivid lesson taught to Grace by Victor himself, one she would never forget for the rest of her life. Rose smiled warmly and said to Oliver, Look at our Gracie, so polite, so well-mannered. She's such a good child. Oliver nodded in agreement. Indeed. Her brother has really done an excellent job raising her. Honestly, I didn't expect it. He's still so young, and a man at that, yet he's so capable of taking care of a child. Rose playfully admonished him. What do you mean taking care of a child? You make it sound like Vic is part of our generation. He's still quite young, isn't he? Gracie, how much older is your brother than you? 5 years. Grace murmured an in response. So, he must be in his early 30s by now. Does your brother have a girlfriend? Oliver quickly tugged at his wife's sleeve. You and your matchmaking. Vic isn't like Gracie. Do you think someone in his position can treat marriage as a trivial matter? Rose nodded repeatedly. True. With his status, even if it's not a business alliance, he'd still need to marry someone from a distinguished, well-educated family, wouldn't he? Exactly. And Vic is so selective. Let's not meddle in his affairs. Grace, however, interjected. Thank you, Rose, but he does have a girlfriend. Both Oliver and Rose looked surprised. Since when? You never mentioned it before. Grace gave a bitter smile. How could she explain? explained that her decision to leave the country this time was largely thanks to this so-called girlfriend. But no, Lily wasn't the girlfriend anymore. On the day Grace boarded her flight, she and Victor were already married. Now Lily should be addressed as Mrs. Hua. I've grown up now. We both have our own lives, and we don't interact much anymore. Her words carried a distinct note of estrangement. Rose seemed a little worried. Gracie, did you decide to go abroad this time because his girlfriend doesn't accept you? What are you saying? Oliver quickly interjected. Gracie came here for better career opportunities, of course. Grace took a deep breath and nodded firmly. Yes. Since Grace had just arrived and hadn't found a place of her own yet, she was temporarily staying at Oliver's home. Rose had already prepared a cozy room for her. Grace lay on the soft, comfortable bed, gazing at the moonlight outside the window. Everything around her felt so unfamiliar, almost unreal. Yes, she had made up her mind to bid farewell to Victor completely and start a new life here. Back at the wedding venue, the walls of the bridal suite were adorned with bright red celebratory symbols. But Lily didn't dare say a word. Grace had vanished. Halfway through the wedding ceremony, Victor couldn't find a trace of her anywhere. He stormed out with a team of people to search for her, leaving Lily alone to face a sea of guests on stage. Lily felt wronged. After finally waiting for Victor to return home, she had planned to throw a tantrum and cry to him. But Victor's face was filled with nothing but disgust. Stay away from me. Lily clenched her teeth in frustration, nearly trembling with rage. She wanted nothing more than to tear Grace apart. She had done this on purpose, ruining her wedding just to sabotage her and Victor. Vic, she cautiously inched closer, leaning into his chest. You've had a long day. Let's rest early, okay? As she spoke, she unfastened the buttons of her jacket, revealing a pink lace undergarment, a silent invitation. But this action only ignited Victor's fury. I told you to stay away. Do you not understand? He yanked his arm away from her embrace with such force that Lily went pale with fright. Vic, I know you're worried, but Gracie is an adult now. She'll be fine. It would have been better if she hadn't mentioned Grace. The moment her name was brought up, Victor's entire demeanor turned icy. Just then his phone rang. Victor answered, and whatever the person on the other end said made him explode in anger. If you can't find her, keep looking. How does a grown woman just disappear? If anything happens to Grace, you'll all have to deal with the consequences. After hanging up, Victor's face was still a brewing storm. As if on cue, another call came in. This time, Victor didn't answer immediately. He stared at the caller ID on the screen for a long moment. Lily noticed his expression. It looked almost panicked. His hand trembled slightly as he held the phone. When he finally answered, his voice was unsteady, almost pleading. Officer Yang, have you found her? Clang! The phone slipped from his hand, hitting the floor. Victor stood there, frozen, as if his soul had been ripped away. Fortunately, the phone survived the fall, and the impact even activated the speaker function. Officer Yang's voice came through the line. We did find a body in the reservoir on the east side. Based on the age and clothing, there's a high likelihood that it's Miss Sue. Lily was stunned. Grace was dead? She'd committed suicide? Did she really love Victor that much? Enough to take her own life on his wedding day? The next second, however, Lily's thoughts veered in a different direction. Victor's feelings for Grace ran so deep that if she were truly dead because of this, he would undoubtedly blame her. And Grace would become his eternal white moonlight, a pure, untouchable memory that no one could ever compete with or replace. The invincible power of a deceased white moonlight? Unshakable. But so what? If Grace were gone, Victor would belong to her alone. There would be no one else to vie for his affection. A smug smile tugged at the corner of Lily's lips, but she knew now wasn't the time to gloat. She pinched her thigh hard. the sharp pain instantly bringing tears to her eyes. She let out a sob, covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Her words came out choked with emotion. "Gracie, how could this happen? If you had any problems you could have told me. I'm your sister-in-law, I would have helped you." "Shut up," Victor roared, his voice thunderous. "Who told you it was Gracie?" Lily froze under the force of his anger, her tears halting mid-flow. "But didn't Officer Young just say, there's a high possibility that it's her?" "A high possibility doesn't mean it's certain. Gracie is a strong girl. She would never do something like this." Saying that, Victor stood abruptly, heading for the door. Lily bit her lip, her eyes brimming with unshed tears as she clung to him pitifully. "Where are you going? Tonight is our wedding night. Are you really going to leave me alone like this?" Victor turned back, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "Lily, you should know your place." What kind of sister-in-law do you think you are?" His brow furrowed sharply, suspicion flashing in his eyes. "Did Gracie's disappearance have anything to do with you?" Lily shook her head vehemently. "I'm the bride today. I've been in my wedding gown all day, surrounded by makeup artists and bridesmaids. I barely even spoke to Gracie." Victor had no patience to argue further. He threw a sharp parting remark as he strode out the door. "If I find out you had anything to do with Gracie's disappearance, Lily, you know what your consequences will be." Lily shuddered, her grip on his sleeve releasing as he disappeared into the night. Victor drove straight to the reservoir in the eastern suburbs, where Officer Young had said the body was found. When he arrived, he saw the figure lying under a white sheet. Officer Young pointed to a sealed evidence bag. "This was recovered from the water. It's likely her clothing. Can you confirm if it belonged to Miss Grace?" Victor didn't even need to inspect it closely. He recognized it instantly, the pale blue dress. It was Grace's favorite, a gift from him on her 18th birthday. 7 years had passed since then. The dress was outdated, its color faded with time, but it remained Grace's most cherished possession. "Mr. Victor?" Victor exhaled softly, his voice barely audible. "It's hers." Officer Young nodded solemnly. "My condolences, Mr. Victor. Such a young woman gone just like that. What a tragedy." Victor stood there in silence for a long time. Mistaking his quiet devastation for grief, Officer Young refrained from pressing further and offered gentle words of comfort. "I heard Miss Grace was a talented photographer. Artists often have such sensitive, fragile souls." "She wasn't fragile." Officer Young paused, startled. "I'm sorry. That was insensitive of me." Victor shook his head. "No, it's not her." "What do you mean?" Victor's voice was steady, resolute. "It's not Grace. But you just confirmed it's her dress?" "She donated all her clothes a long time ago." Without waiting for a reply, Victor strode forward and pulled back the white sheet covering the body. The onlookers gasped audibly. "Mr. Victor, what are you doing?" Officer Young exclaimed in startled protest. But Victor's body sagged with visible relief the moment he saw the girl's face. "Mr. Victor, are you okay?" He closed his eyes, his voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "It's not her. Thank God. It's not her." Just then his phone buzzed in his pocket. "Mr. Victor, your phone. Do you want to take it?" He glanced at the screen. It was Lily. He rejected the call. It rang again. He rejected it again. The third time his patience snapped. "What do you want?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, trembling slightly under the weight of his fury. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Victor. There's a package for you. Could you come to sign for it?" "A package?" Victor frowned. "Who's it from?" "It's from Miss Grace." Victor shot to his feet, barking into the phone. "Stay right where you are. I'm coming now." He drove faster than he ever had in his life, speeding back to his home. At the entrance to his gated community, he spotted the delivery man. But the man was empty-handed. "Where's my package?" Victor grabbed the delivery man by the arm, his voice sharp and urgent. "Didn't you say there was a package from Grace for me?" The delivery man flinched, visibly startled. "Mr. Victor? Your wife already signed for it. I just handed it to her." Victor's face darkened. "What wife?" The delivery man's confusion deepened. "Huh, no wife. But the lady earlier said she was Mrs. Victor." Victor didn't wait for another word. He stormed into the villa, his steps heavy and determined. "Lily, where are you?" In the bathroom, Lily froze. The sound of Victor's voice sent shivers coursing through her. She hastily threw the item in her hand into the toilet, pressing the flush button repeatedly in a panic. But in the next moment, the door was kicked open with a deafening crash. Victor snatched the box from Lily's trembling hands and tore through its contents. His fingers moved frantically, his breath uneven. Inside were photos. Dozens of them. Photos of him. From his teenage years to the man he was today, the images captured every stage of his life. There he was in a school uniform, basketball gear, a tailored suit, and even casual home attire. Front-facing, side profiles, and even candid shots of his back. There were photos he remembered being taken, and others he hadn't even realized existed. They were all of him, and they were all taken by Grace. Some were amateurish with awkward angles and inconsistent lighting, clearly from her early days of photography. Yet even those were imbued with a warmth, a love so palpable that Victor could feel it radiating off the pictures. In those images, he looked like he was bathed in golden light, as if Grace's affection had coated him in a soft, ethereal glow. As her photography skills improved, the pictures became more refined. The composition was deliberate, the lighting perfect. And through her lens, Victor transformed, from a boy fumbling through youth into a tall, composed man. There he was, focused at work. There he was, eating with quiet gentleness. Every photo captured him in moments of authenticity, as if Grace had seen parts of him no one else ever could. Victor's hands trembled as he flipped through the photos, his emotions a chaotic storm. He laughed. He cried. And then he laughed again through the tears. Grace had loved him. She had always loved him. Her feelings were imprinted in every single frame, screaming her devotion in a way words never could. When he reached the last photo, Victor froze. His breath hitched. It was his wedding photo. Grace had taken it herself. In the image, he was dressed in a pristine white suit, his arm linked with another woman's. The woman wasn't Grace. A sharp pain lanced through his chest, so sudden and overwhelming that it nearly brought him to his knees. His hand instinctively clutched at his heart as the photo slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor. But something on the back of the photo caught his eye. There was writing. Grace's handwriting. He scrambled to pick it up, his vision blurring as he tried to make out the words. "Victor, maybe it's time I call you what I should have all along, brother. I wish you happiness, my dear brother." It felt as though a massive hole had been punched through his chest, the icy wind of regret and loss rushing in to fill the void. Frantically, Victor began flipping the photos over, one by one, desperate for more messages. "Victor, you look so cool playing basketball." "Victor, I'm 18 now. I'm an adult. I want to choose who I love. I love you, don't you know that?" "Victor, I secretly took another photo of you today. When you're angry, you're kind of scary, but you're never angry with me. Does that mean I'm a little special to you? Victor, will we be together someday? I thought I was sure, but now I'm not. Please give me an answer." "Victor, that love letter wasn't for me. But when I saw how upset you got for my sake, it made me wonder, do I actually matter to you? Victor, do you see me as just a sister? Or something more?" The last photo he flipped had only half a message. The other half had been torn away. On the back there were just 3 words. "Victor, I." Victor snapped his head toward Lily, his eyes ablaze with fury. He grabbed her wrist, his grip iron tight. Where's the rest of it? Where's the other half of this photo? Victor, please, you're scaring me. I'm asking you where it is. Speak. Lily's fear morphed into defiance, her voice trembling but sharp. I tore it up and flushed it down the toilet. It's gone. All of it. Before she could finish, Victor shoved her away, sending her sprawling to the floor. Victor, she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. I did it for you. Don't you see? Grace had improper feelings for you. If these photos got out, they'd ruin your reputation. I had to destroy them for your sake. Get out, Victor growled, his voice low and venomous. No, I won't leave. I'm your wife, Victor. Grace is gone. She's never coming back. But I'm here. I can. Get out. Lily tried to stand, reaching for him, but Victor didn't hold back this time. He shoved her away with more force, his anger barely restrained. Victor, please listen to me. His voice cut through the air like a blade. Get out of Grace's house. Now. The security team arrived shortly after. They escorted Lily out of the villa, her belongings unceremoniously dumped alongside her. Victor stood in the living room, the silence oppressive yet strangely comforting. For the first time in a long while, the house felt peaceful, like Grace was still there, her presence lingering in every corner. He sank onto the couch, the photos spread across the table before him. His fingers hovered over them, trembling as he traced Grace's handwriting, her love etched into every word. And for the first time, Victor let the weight of it all crush him. He sat there alone, mourning a love he hadn't realized he'd lost until it was too late. He held the photo box tightly, his fingers gently tracing the handwriting on the surface. Grace had been part of the Victor household since she was little. In fact, even her handwriting was the result of him guiding her hand, stroke by stroke, when she was learning to write. Gracie, where are you right now? Victor cradled the photo box as if it were a priceless treasure. Gracie, where are you? Grace woke up with a start from her dream. Rose, sitting nearby, noticed her pale complexion and asked, What's wrong? Did you have a nightmare? Grace blinked, finally snapping out of her daze. Today, she was out with Oliver and Rose for lunch, and they were also introducing her to the editor of an international magazine. However, the editor had been delayed due to an unexpected situation, and Grace, feeling a bit restless these days, had dozed off on the couch while waiting. Grace here. A clean white handkerchief was handed to her by a familiar hand. Grace hesitated for a moment before taking it. Thanks, Seth. She dabbed at the light sheen of sweat on her forehead, still somewhat caught in the lingering emotions of the dream. Seth smiled reassuringly. It's just a nightmare. Once you wake up, all the scary stuff disappears. Besides, you've got Oliver, Rose, and the rest of us here with you. Rose teased him with a playful grin. The rest of us? Who else? Well, Seth stammered awkwardly, glancing toward the sunlight streaming through the window. And the great weather. A sunny day like this can do wonders for your mood. Rose chuckled, clearly amused but choosing not to press further. All right, fine. The sun is here for Gracie too. A faint blush crept up Seth's cheeks. But Rose still looked a bit concerned as she noticed Grace's troubled expression. Gracie, you really don't need to stress so much. The editor is a great guy, funny, easygoing, and an old friend of Oliver's. He's already seen your photography work and is super impressed. Grace nodded. I know. It's just, I had a dream about. About what? About the past. What's so scary about the past? Your brother practically spoiled you like a princess growing up. It should have been a sweet dream, right? Grace didn't know how to explain. Thankfully, Seth stepped in to help. No one lives their entire life in a bubble of sweetness. Grace has her own worries too. Really? Gracie, was your brother too strict with you? I think Oliver mentioned something like that once. But as someone who's like family, he must have just been looking out for you. Parents and brothers can't help but be protective of their kids. Seth interjected again. Rose, Grace is her own person. Let's not keep bringing up her brother. Rose looked at him curiously but decided to drop the subject when Grace didn't object. All right, no more talk about him then. Grace shot Seth a grateful look. Thanks, Seth. It wasn't that she couldn't let go of Victor. From the moment she boarded the plane, she had already made the decision to leave it all behind. But her life story was so deeply intertwined with Victor's that it was impossible to escape his shadow. Whether it was classmates, friends, or teachers, conversations with her always seemed to circle back to him in one way or another. Seth, perhaps more than anyone else, understood her. Only after leaving Victor did she feel like an independent person, someone whose emotions weren't tied to another. She was finally free, unburdened, and truly herself. The editor eventually arrived, albeit fashionably late. He turned out to be a jovial middle-aged man who greeted Grace with a playful comment the moment he saw her. Haven't we met somewhere before? Grace had already composed herself, ready to face the impromptu interview with her best self. She smiled and quipped, "Editor, that's such a cliché pickup line." The editor laughed heartily. "You've got a sharp sense of humor, Miss Grace." "Not just a sense of humor. My photography skills are top-notch too. Confident, witty, poised, and brilliant." Even without Victor, Grace could shine all on her own. As they wrapped up, the editor urged her to join his team. "We've got a big feature coming up at the magazine, involving some pretty high-profile subjects. We're in desperate need of a talented photographer. Miss Grace, if you're interested, you're welcome to start anytime." Grace agreed without hesitation. "Oh, by the way," the editor added, "that comment earlier wasn't just a pickup line. I genuinely feel like we've met before." Grace chuckled. "I only just got to Milan recently. Maybe you met someone who looks like me." The editor didn't press further. Maybe. But as he sat in his car afterward, a thought nagged at him. He racked his brain trying to recall where he might have crossed paths with her. His driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Boss, did you fall for that girl or something?" The editor shot back immediately. "She's so much younger than me. I think of her more like a little sister." Then suddenly a light bulb went off in his mind. "I remember where I've seen her." Meanwhile, Victor was on the phone with Officer Yang, discussing the ongoing search. A living, breathing person, missing for so many days without a single lead. Officer Yang advised Victor to mentally prepare for the worst. But Victor refused to accept that possibility. The police officer's explanation was simple. "Miss Grace went missing from your wedding. She didn't bring any luggage, no wallet, nothing. And it's been so long without a single call for help. Mr. Victor, you need to prepare yourself for the worst." Victor's phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. He answered, "What is it, Eric?" "I'm in the middle of something." "Vic, I just saw your sister." Victor didn't even know how he survived the 8-hour flight after hearing Eric's news. His first reaction was confusion. She left the country? And went to Milan? But how? He had already checked the airport records, and Grace's name wasn't on any flight list. Relief followed quickly. At least she was safe and alive. That was all that mattered. But then anger surged up, burning through him. Why did she leave without a word? Even if she wanted to explore opportunities abroad, why didn't she tell him? Grace had moved out of Oliver and Rose's home and found a new place. After all, she had only been staying with them temporarily. Even though both Oliver and Rose were kind and welcoming, she didn't want to impose for too long. When Seth heard about her move, he showed up to help without hesitation. Grace had arrived with barely anything, so once she settled into her new apartment, she decided to go shopping for some home essentials. She was browsing through a fabric store when, to her dismay, her period arrived early. She could feel the warmth spreading, but the store was crowded, and she didn't want to make it obvious. It would only make things more awkward. Here, take this. A men's jacket appeared in front of her. Seth was holding it out with a casual smile. I'm feeling a bit hot. Could you hold on to this for me? Grace quickly realized that Seth must have noticed. But instead of making things awkward, he had come up with this considerate way to help her. Her cheeks flushed and she nodded. Thanks, Seth. He grinned. Seen anything you like yet? She shook her head. Wanna check out the next store? Sure. After they left the fabric store, Seth said, Wait here for a sec. Then he dashed off toward a nearby convenience store. When he returned, he handed her a small packet, his cheeks slightly pink. I wasn't sure which brand you prefer, and I don't know much about this stuff, so I just went with what the store clerk recommended. Grace held the packet in her hand, feeling a wave of warmth in her chest. Thanks, this is perfect. Good. The restroom's just to the left. Go ahead, I'll wait here. She slipped on Seth's oversized jacket. It was baggy enough to cover the stain on her pants, which was a relief. His jacket smelled different from Victor's. Victor's clothes always carried the sophisticated scent of cologne, but Seth's jacket had a clean, minty fragrance, with a faint hint of sunshine. When Grace came out of the restroom, Seth was still waiting, now playing with a toddler. The little boy giggled and waved his arms excitedly, clearly enjoying Seth's company. Seth. He glanced up at her and smiled. Oh, the kid's mom needed to use the restroom, so she asked me to watch him for a bit. Grace looked surprised. You know his mom? Nope. And she just trusted you with her kid? Seth scratched his head, looking a little helpless. I don't know why, but every time I go out, people are always asking me for directions or favors. Grace could understand. Seth had this naturally warm and approachable vibe. He was attentive, kind, and gentle. A completely different type from Victor. Seth, what did you want to talk about? He hesitated for a moment, then looked her straight in the eye. I like you. Grace's head shot up in surprise. Seth looked a little nervous but mustered the courage to continue. Actually, I've liked you since back in school. But remember that mix-up with the love letter? And then out of nowhere I got sent abroad. I never got the chance to tell you. When Oliver told me you'd finally agreed to come overseas, I was so happy. Grace wasn't entirely caught off guard. Ever since she arrived in Milan, Seth had been doing things that went far beyond what a casual senior would do for her. She wasn't a child. She had her suspicions. To be honest, she didn't dislike Seth. In fact, she thought he was a great guy. What surprised her was how quickly he confessed. She asked, Don't you think this is a bit too fast? We haven't spent that much time together yet. Seth replied earnestly, Life's too short. I've already wasted 7 years because I wasn't brave enough before. I don't want to waste another second. This time I don't want to keep hiding in the shadows, nursing a secret crush. I want to tell you what's in my heart. I've prepared myself for the possibility of rejection, but I can't keep staying silent. That would only mean missing out again. These words stirred something deep within Grace. Yes, she liked Victor. She had liked him for so many years, waiting endlessly for him to confess his feelings. But maybe things weren't as complicated as she had made them out to be. She could take the initiative, couldn't she? She could tell Victor how she felt. Even if he rejected her, the worst that could happen was that their relationship would stay exactly as it was now. Grace, you don't have to answer me right away. Take your time to think it over. Grace opened her mouth. Before she could finish her sentence, a strong force pulled her into an embrace. The familiar scent of cologne filled her senses. She didn't even have to look to know who it was. No one knew Victor's embrace better than she did. But in just a few days apart, Grace found that it felt strangely unfamiliar now. It's really you. You're okay. Thank God. Come on, let's go home. Seth spoke up, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. Grace, who is this? Grace gently pushed Victor away, putting a polite distance between them. Then, with a composed expression, she introduced him. Let me introduce you. This is my brother. Victor frowned slightly. Brother? Isn't that right? Gracie, Victor said, his voice low and filled with emotion. I saw the photos you left for me. Grace's face remained impassive. She simply responded with a soft, "Oh, but some of them were destroyed by Lily." That's to be expected, Grace replied calmly. She's your wife. She has every right to do whatever she wants with your belongings. She's not. Victor's hands gripped her shoulders tightly as he hurried to explain. Gracie, I didn't marry her. I called off the wedding the moment I realized you were gone. I've been looking for you everywhere these past few days. And then I saw a girl wearing the clothes you donated who tried to take her own life. For a second, I thought I'd lost you forever. Grace frowned, her voice sharp. Brother, let go of me. You're hurting me. Stop calling me brother. Grace looked up at him, a faint smile playing on her lips. All right then, Mr. Victor. Does that work for you? Victor's frustration boiled over. Grace. Grace took a deep breath, pried his hands off her shoulders one by one, and stepped back, standing firmly beside Seth. I wasn't done with introductions earlier, Grace said calmly. Brother, this is my boyfriend, Seth. Seth looked startled, but not nearly as shocked as Victor. How long have you known him? Grace, don't treat this as a joke. Brother relationships aren't about how long you've known someone. It's about how you connect. Her words were laden with unspoken meaning, and Victor couldn't miss it. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Gracie, can we talk? Just the two of us. Victor, there's nothing left for us to talk about. Your new bride is waiting for you. I'm doing well in Milan. I have a job and I have company. Thank you for all the care you've shown me over the years. I'll repay you and the family for it. I don't want your repayment. Then what do you want? Victor froze. He wanted her. But faced with Grace's cold, detached gaze, he couldn't bring himself to say it. Victor, go home. You've already let one woman down. Don't let down another. Lily is not my woman. Gracie, just give me 10 minutes, please. Let me explain everything to you. My boyfriend and I have things to do. Maybe next time. Grace gently tugged Seth's sleeve, and he followed her as she walked away. They had gone some distance when Seth hesitated and said, Your brother hasn't left. He's still standing there. Don't look back, Grace said with a faint smile. Come on. Let's go look at some other furniture. Are you sure you're okay leaving him like that? He seemed really sad. Grace let out a small laugh. He's newlywed, with a devoted wife by his side. How could he possibly be sad? The rest of the afternoon passed with Seth accompanying her as they wandered through the mall. Grace bought all sorts of things. Figurines from her favorite anime, wall art, and even a gigantic plush bear. One so large it was bigger than Seth himself. As Seth carried the enormous bear through the mall, they drew stares from everyone they passed. Feeling self-conscious, Seth turned to Grace and asked, Do I look ridiculous right now? Before Grace could respond, two young women walking by giggled and chimed in. Not at all. We think you must really love your girlfriend. Seth's face turned bright red. I'm just hot. This bear is so warm, he stammered awkwardly. Grace couldn't help but laugh. Maybe having a boyfriend like Seth, someone so simple, so kind, wasn't such a bad thing after all. At least with him, she didn't need to constantly wonder if she was truly loved. His actions said it all. I care about you. By the time Seth dropped her off at home, the sky had already darkened. Seth didn't step into Grace's house. Ever the gentleman, he stopped at the front door and carefully placed all her belongings outside. Why are you just standing there? Grace called to him with a grin. Come in. Seth hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. Grace, what you said earlier, was it true? What did I say? You said that I'm your boyfriend. Grace paused for a moment as if weighing her words before nodding firmly. I accept your confession, and I really admire your courage. But right now I think we're at the let's see how it goes stage. I'm not quite at the point of liking you in that way yet. If you're okay with that, we can take it slow and see where it leads. Seth's face lit up with excitement. Really? You mean it? Grace smiled. Yeah. I thought. What did you think? I thought you were just saying that to mess with your brother. To, get under his skin or something. Grace sighed, her voice tinged with nostalgia. If this were the past, maybe that would have been the case. And now? Now I really want to start fresh. A new life. Grace's tone was steady, her words deliberate. Grace, you liked your brother, didn't you? I mean before. Seth's voice was gentle yet probing. Grace didn't dodge the question. She nodded. I did. She thought Seth might press her further, asking about her feelings now, or be shocked by the revelation. But instead he busied himself lugging a giant stuffed bear inside her house, huffing and puffing as sweat started to trickle down his face. Grace couldn't help but burst into laughter at the sight of him. What's so funny? Seth asked, wiping his face with his sleeve. I thought you'd ask me if I still liked him. You already said it, those feelings were in the past, Seth replied casually, flashing her an easygoing smile. I believe you. Time slipped by like water through fingers. Since that day, Victor had disappeared from Grace's life. He hadn't shown up again, not even once. Surprisingly, Grace found herself thinking about him less and less these days. Seth, on the other hand, treated her well, not with over-the-top eagerness to define their relationship, but with a quiet, steady presence. He was the kind of person who cared for her in subtle, unassuming ways, like a gentle drizzle nourishing the earth. It was this calm, secure rhythm of life with Seth that gave Grace a sense of grounding she hadn't felt in a long time. One morning, Grace was jolted awake by a call from her editor at Milan magazine. Grace, I have a friend, Jeff, who's a talk show host. He's interviewing a big-name guest today, yes, the one I mentioned before. Are you free to handle the photography? Sure, I can do it. When and where? ASAP. I'll text you the address and Jeff's contact info right now, the editor replied, clearly relieved Grace could step in last minute. Knowing there was no time to waste, Grace quickly grabbed her gear and hailed a cab. She arrived at the studio in record time, where everything was already set up and the staff were bustling around. All they were waiting for was her. As she scanned the room trying to locate Jeff, her eyes landed on someone else instead. Even in the crowded, noisy space, Victor stood out like a beacon. Grace froze. She hadn't expected him to be the guest. He hadn't gone back to the country yet? Had he been in Milan this whole time? Her thoughts remained calm, surprisingly free of any emotional turbulence. That was until Victor noticed her presence. Their eyes met across the room. Neither of them moved closer. Neither of them spoke. It was as if an invisible barrier kept them in place. Jeff, noticing Victor's sudden change in demeanor, followed his line of sight and spotted Grace. His face lit up as he hurried over. You must be Grace. Wow, you're fast. Thanks so much for coming on such short notice. The editor asked me to step in, Grace replied smoothly, shifting her gaze away from Victor to focus on Jeff. Though it was their first time meeting, Jeff seemed instantly impressed by her. Oliver's mentioned you before. Said you're young, crazy talented, and super professional. He wasn't kidding. And I mean you're gorgeous too, bonus points. He gestured for her to follow him, leading her directly toward Victor. Mr. Ho, this is Grace, Jeff said enthusiastically. She's one of the best young photographers out there. With her on board, today's shoot is going to be a breeze. Victor responded with a curt, indifferent nod. Grace, let me introduce you to What's the theme of today's interview? Grace cut in, her tone brisk and professional. I'd like to go over the creative direction before we start. That way, we can ensure everything runs smoothly and efficiently. Jeff blinked, momentarily thrown off. Let's leave that to Mr. Ho. Whatever he prefers is fine by me. We're lucky to have him here, he's a huge deal. Honestly, as long as he's happy, we'll make it work. It was rare for Victor to make an appearance in public, and everyone was scrambling to capitalize on the buzz his presence would generate. Grace had never mentioned her prior acquaintance with Victor, and when Jeff suggested she speak with him directly, she responded with a composed and detached tone. Mr. Victor, go ahead. Her words were polite yet distant, as light as a breeze. Victor, however, sidestepped her invitation to speak, instead remarking, the environment here seems a bit chaotic. Since it's almost lunchtime, why don't the three of us find a restaurant and discuss things over a meal? Though his words included both Grace and Jeff, Victor's gaze lingered solely on Grace, as if afraid she might vanish again. Grace, however, was completely uninterested. I already have plans for lunch and won't be able to stay long. Here's an idea. You two can talk, finalize the photography requirements, and send me a document with the details. As she spoke, her phone conveniently began to ring, as if on cue. Someone was indeed calling her at just the right moment. Grace didn't bother hiding it. She casually answered the call right in front of them. On the other end of the line, Seth's voice was as gentle as ever. Are you done over there? I'm heading back now and can pick you up. Then we can head to Oliver's place together. No matter where she intended to go, Seth always managed to make it seem like it was on his way. A faint smile curved Grace's lips. I'm wrapping up now and just about to head out. Perfect, Seth replied. I'm actually already outside the studio in my car. What a coincidence, Grace said playfully. Seth chuckled softly but didn't respond further. Both of them knew full well that it wasn't mere coincidence. He had deliberately arrived early to wait for her. Grace didn't bring it up. After hanging up, she turned to Jeff and said, As you heard, I really do have plans for lunch, so I'll have to leave now. Victor, standing beside Jeff, was entirely ignored. He watched as Grace jogged out of the studio, her steps light and quick, and got into Seth's car. Jeff, watching the car pull away, couldn't help but comment to Victor with a touch of admiration. Those two are students of a good friend of mine. I heard they're a couple, very much in love and extremely stable. If I'm not mistaken, I'd say they'll probably tie the knot soon. Every word Jeff uttered felt like a dagger to Victor's heart. By the time Victor's face visibly darkened, Jeff had only just begun extolling the virtues of the seemingly perfect couple. Victor cut him off abruptly, his voice cold. I've got urgent matters to attend to this afternoon. Let's reschedule lunch. Of course. Take care, Mr. Victor, Jeff replied, reminding him. Don't forget to send me the finalized photography requirements when you have them. I'll forward them to Grace. Jeff still believed this was Victor and Grace's first meeting. Victor, however, either didn't hear him or chose to ignore the reminder. Without so much as a glance back, he walked away briskly. Earlier, Jeff and Victor had been getting along quite well, so this sudden shift in his demeanor left Jeff baffled and suspicious. No one had offended him, so what could have caused this change? Meanwhile, in Seth's car, a similar curiosity arose. Seth glanced at Grace and asked, What's wrong? You don't look too well. Grace didn't answer directly. Instead, she leaned back in her seat and said, Maybe it's the weather lately, too much fluctuation. It feels a bit chilly. Seth didn't think much of it. How about we have something warm for lunch? Oliver mentioned he's been craving hot pot. We could pick up some ingredients and make it at his place. Afterward, you might not feel so cold. It was a seasonally appropriate suggestion. Not wanting to dampen Seth's enthusiasm, Grace agreed. Together, they stopped by a supermarket to pick up everything they needed. By the time they arrived at Oliver's home with their groceries, it was just about lunchtime. Oliver was delighted to see his 2 students arriving with food. "Perfect timing," he said, taking the bags into the kitchen. With a warm smile, he added to Grace, "Your brother is here too. Since we're all together, let's sit down and enjoy a meal." Seth instinctively glanced at Grace. "Sounds great," Grace replied, her expression completely unchanged. She smiled back at Oliver and followed him into the kitchen to help prepare. Once everything was ready, she joined the others at the dining table. By then, Seth and Victor had already been silently coexisting in the same space for a while, each treating the other as if they weren't there. The hot pot was bubbling and steaming at the center of the table, but the atmosphere between the diners was anything but warm. No one initiated a conversation. The sound of Seth using the communal chopsticks to add ingredients to the pot was louder than the bubbling broth. Grace, seated between Seth and Oliver, had intentionally chosen this spot to avoid Victor. And yet, when she looked up, she realized she was now directly across from him. Victor stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a polite smile, he turned to Oliver and struck up a conversation. "Oliver, how was Gracie's time abroad? Was her work and life going smoothly?" He could have asked Grace directly, but instead, he made a point of addressing Oliver, as if Grace weren't sitting right there. Oliver didn't think much of it as he picked up a slice of fish with his chopsticks and began eating, recounting earnestly, "Gracie is doing great. Everyone who's ever dealt with her has nothing but praise for her. My friends even joke about how lucky I am to have taught such an outstanding student." "She hasn't caused you any trouble, has she?" Oliver quickly shook his head. "Of course not. If anything, I have Gracie and Seth to thank for visiting me every now and then. Without them, I can't imagine how dull my days would be." As he spoke, his gaze flickered between Grace and Seth, who were seated next to each other, and his smile grew even warmer. "Victor, this is Seth," Oliver continued, his tone carrying a hint of pride. "He's also one of my students. I'm sure Grace has already mentioned him to you. I won't go on about him, but out of all the students I've taught, these 2 are the most exceptional. What I'm trying to say is, perhaps." His intention to play matchmaker between Grace and Seth in front of Victor was as subtle as a flashing neon sign. But Victor didn't let him finish the thought. He interrupted politely but firmly. "Oliver, I understand what you're suggesting, but they're not a good match." Oliver's expression froze for a moment. Victor cast a dismissive glance at Seth and stated nonchalantly, "Actually, I have something to discuss with Grace on this trip. I've already chosen a future husband for her." "Really? That's news to me. Grace hasn't mentioned anything like that before," Oliver said, his concern slipping through as he pressed. "Who is it? Do I know him?" "Yes, you could say you do. And what's his situation like?" Victor considered for a moment before replying. "He runs his own company and is financially secure enough to allow Grace to pursue anything she wants. His reputation is solid, and he's quite fond of her." Grace couldn't take it anymore. She cut him off sharply. "That's enough." Her outburst drew everyone's attention. Oliver, noticing the usually composed Grace suddenly lose her temper, finally sensed that something was off. His eyes darted between her and Victor, suspecting some kind of conflict between the siblings. Realizing her slip, Grace took a deep breath to steady herself before saying, "I'm sorry. I have no interest in wealth. I'm happy with my current job, and my salary is more than enough for me to do what I want. You don't need to worry about me, Victor." Victor responded coolly, "If I don't worry about you, then who will?" "I'm an adult now," Grace said, her tone firm but controlled. "I can take charge of my own life. I don't need anyone to be responsible for me, let alone manage me. Even if you're an adult, you grew up under my care. With our parents gone, It's my responsibility to make sure you're not taken advantage of. Victor's voice had taken on an edge of anger, and the icy glare he shot at Seth could have frozen water. Grace felt her patience snapping. She decided to stop holding back. I'm not with Seth just to defy you. I genuinely think he's a good man. Spending time with him these past weeks has made me feel happy and at ease. I said no, and that's final. Victor slammed his chopsticks onto the table, the sharp noise breaking through the tension in the room. Grace, come home with me now. Grace refused to back down any longer, even out of respect for Oliver. She stood abruptly and retorted, "This isn't your house, Victor. You can't throw your weight around and expect everyone to fall in line." "Grace, I'm only trying to protect you. You keep saying you have to take care of me. Fine, then tell me, what exactly are you to me right now? A distant relative? Or perhaps just a so-called brother?" She emphasized the last word heavily, her tone laced with defiance. Victor found himself at a crossroads. If he acknowledged his role as her brother, it would mean giving up any possibility of a future beyond their familial bond. He would be forever confined to the role of her guardian. But if he denied it, it would mean relinquishing his right to interfere in her personal life, including her choice of partner. The room was thick with tension, the atmosphere charged and brittle. Sensing that the argument revolved around Grace's romantic life, Oliver glanced apologetically at Seth and tried to mediate. "All right, Victor. Even if you found someone suitable, there's no need to rush. Let Grace share her thoughts, and then we can discuss it calmly." "No," Victor said resolutely. "There's nothing to discuss." Grace didn't want to make things harder for Oliver. She grabbed her coat and forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry for ruining the hot pot dinner. Please enjoy the rest of the meal. I'll head out first." True to her word, she turned and left without hesitation. She even told Seth to stay behind and keep Oliver company. Victor, however, wasn't about to let her leave so easily. Ignoring Oliver's attempts to stop him, he followed her out, his steps quick and determined. "Grace, stop right there." But Grace didn't so much as glance back, her pace quickening as she walked down the street. Seeing that she was about to leave the neighborhood, Victor abandoned all pretense. He rushed forward, grabbed her arm, and softened his tone as he pleaded, "Gracie, please just hear me out." "Victor, how many times do I have to tell you before you understand? I know exactly what you're about to say, but I don't want to hear it." The heated argument between Grace and Victor ended with him grabbing her wrist and forcing her into his car, which was parked by the side of the road. He pushed her down into the passenger seat and locked the door from the inside. No matter how much Grace wanted to ignore him, she had no choice but to stay confined with him in the cramped space of the car. "You've already ruined everything. What more do you want?" Her voice trembled with rage, her reddened eyes betraying her anger. "This is a foreign country, Victor. Your usual tactics won't work here. If you don't let me out, I'll report you for unlawful restraint." Victor's voice lacked the ironclad resolve that usually characterized him. He took a deep breath before speaking, his tone hoarse in a way Grace had never heard before. "I'm sorry," he began, his words surprisingly raw. "I'm doing this because I need to tell you something. After you left, I finally realized the person I've loved all along has always been you. So it doesn't matter who you love. I won't accept it. The only person who can stay by your side for the rest of your life is me." For the first time, he showed a hint of vulnerability in front of her. Yet even his confession felt more like a demand than an admission of love. Grace found it absurd. She let out a dry laugh. "Victor, you must have the wrong person. These words aren't meant for me. You should be saying them to Lily." Victor pinched the bridge of his nose, clearly frustrated. "Can you stop bringing her up?" "No, I can't," Grace replied defiantly, as if she wanted to rub salt into the wound. "Victor, I've already accepted Lily as my sister-in-law. I'm even willing to wish the two of you a lifetime of happiness and lots of kids. What more could you possibly want? Enough. Or is it that you and your fiancé had a fight? She deliberately called him Victor with every sentence, each time striking him like a hammer. His head throbbed, and his chest felt tight with frustration. He wanted to tell her to stop calling him that, but he couldn't come up with a valid reason, so he simply snapped, "You." Before he could finish his retort, Grace seized the moment. She abruptly began pounding on the car window, yelling at the top of her lungs, "Help! Somebody help me!" Coincidentally, a pair of police officers patrolling the area heard the commotion and immediately walked over to investigate. It wasn't until the officers knocked on the driver's side window with stern expressions that Victor realized Grace wasn't bluffing earlier. She had meant every word, but by then it was too late. "Sir, step out of the car," one officer demanded. Reluctantly, Victor unlocked the car door and got out, joining Grace in facing the officer's questioning. He tried to explain, "Officers, this is a misunderstanding. We know each other." His tone, however, carried a hint of impatience, which only deepened the officer's suspicion. One of them turned to Grace for confirmation. "Is that true?" Grace's expression was cold as ice. "He's just a so-called brother, but we're not even related by blood." Victor stared at her in disbelief. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but the officers didn't give him the chance. Grace stood there, unmoving, until she was sure Victor was being taken to the station for further questioning and would no longer be able to bother her. Only then did she take out her phone and call Seth. "Can you come pick me up?" she asked. "Where are you?" "I'm on my way," Seth replied without hesitation, asking no further questions. Grace stood quietly by the roadside, looking frail and vulnerable, as though a single gust of wind could carry her away. When Seth arrived, she greeted him softly. "How's Oliver doing?" "He's okay," Seth reassured her. "Just a bit confused. Don't worry, I've already explained everything to him." Grace nodded. "That's good." Seth hesitated as though wanting to say more, but he refrained from asking why she seemed even more despondent now. It wasn't until they returned to her apartment and he handed her a cup of warm tea that he finally asked with gentle concern, "Did your brother regret it?" Seth wasn't oblivious or naive. He was simply kind-hearted. He understood that no ordinary sibling relationship would lead to such intense conflicts over a romantic matter. Grace nodded slightly. "But I don't regret it." She looked up to meet his gaze, her eyes resolute and unwavering as she added, "From now on, the only two options between him and me are being siblings or strangers. It's up to him to decide." The past was the past. What she wanted was a fresh start. Meanwhile, Victor spent the better part of his day at the police station, enduring rounds of questioning. It wasn't until James, his assistant, arrived with the necessary documentation to vouch for him that he was finally released. As he stepped outside and took in the fresh air, his mood remained dark and heavy. James, sensing his boss's displeasure, wisely kept his presence as unobtrusive as possible. Unfortunately, this was the exact moment Lily decided to show up. The moment she saw him, she burst into tears and threw herself at him. "Victor, you have to help me. I've been pushed to the edge by those people. I had no choice but to hide abroad, but they still managed to find me." Her words dripped with pitiable desperation, as if her very survival depended on Victor's intervention. But Victor, now seeing her true colors, felt only exhaustion. "How much money do you need?" he asked plainly. Lily's face lit up with joy, and she was about to name a generous figure when Victor pulled out his phone. Whatever he saw on the screen made his expression darken, his gaze toward her turning cold and lifeless. "Victor, what's wrong?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. She shivered instinctively, then cautiously moved closer to him. Victor let out a cold laugh. Did you have the same expression on your face when you texted Gracie earlier? Lily froze in place, forcing a dry smile onto her face. What text? Wasn't Gracie reported missing? How could I possibly be in contact with her? That's impossible. Grace should have given up on Victor by now. Victor didn't bother to respond further. Instead, he raised his hand, showing her the screen of his phone. Moments ago, the private investigator he had hired back home had made some progress. They had recovered data from a phone and forwarded it directly to him. Lily's eyes fell on the provocative messages she had sent Grace in the past. A flicker of panic crossed her face, but she quickly gritted her teeth and retorted, "Vic, these weren't sent by me. Someone's framing me. Yes, it must be Grace. She's never liked me. Enough." Victor's sharp voice cut through the air. The room fell silent. Not even the sound of breathing could be heard. Victor's hand holding the phone trembled slightly. Looming over Lily, he delivered his final question, his voice heavy with accusation. "Was it you who forced Gracie to leave the country?" The overlooked clues from the past began to coalesce at this moment, the truth finally emerging from the shadows. Lily stared at Victor, whose demeanor had taken a complete 180-degree turn. Fear crept into her expression, but she wasn't ready to give up on this golden goose just yet. Softening her voice, she attempted to plead with him. "Vic, you know I've always liked her. Why would I ever hurt her?" Her words trailed off, growing fainter and fainter, until they disappeared altogether. She dared not continue after meeting Victor's frosty, unforgiving gaze. This time things were not going to end well. Victor's mind buzzed with a cacophony of anger and regret, emotions surging to the brink. Yet no matter how much he wished, he couldn't turn back time. All that remained was self-loathing. He refused to look at Lily even once more. His words dropped like ice. "I warned you, Gracie is my limit. You could play along with me, act the part to get her to confess her true feelings, to make her realize how important I am to her. But you were never allowed to harm her. Not even a little. Now leave." Lily's entire body trembled. She instinctively reached out to grab Victor's sleeve, but he stepped back, evading her touch, leaving her hand suspended in the air. Her voice cracked as she cried, "I swear I didn't." Victor was utterly disgusted by her. With a cold indifference, he turned away, refusing to engage further. Just then his phone rang again. It was his housekeeper back home, calling to report on the ongoing investigation. Turning his back to Lily, he answered, "Yes? What is it?" The housekeeper's voice was steady but grim. "Mr. Victor, the specialists you hired to recover the surveillance footage have completed their work. The recordings have been sent over. Your suspicions were correct. Someone was deliberately provoking Miss Gracie." Victor's knuckles whitened as his grip on the phone tightened. Who was it? The answer was already forming in his mind as he slowly turned his gaze toward Lily. Lily's fear was palpable, but she didn't dare run. She owed a mountain of debt, and if she didn't get money from Victor, it would only be a matter of time before her creditors caught up with her. The housekeeper's voice continued on the other end of the line. It was Miss Lily. She intentionally smeared lipstick on herself, leading Miss Gracie to misunderstand. The implication was clear. Everyone involved was an adult, and lipstick smudged in certain places could only resemble one thing: a lover's mark. Victor ended the call and turned back toward Lily once more. Gesturing toward James, his assistant, he said, "Take care of her. I don't want her anywhere near me again." James immediately understood. He approached Lily, stopping her as she cried and pleaded, trying to get closer to Victor. Victor walked away without a backward glance, getting into his car. He sped toward Grace's current residence, his mind racing. He had to find her to explain everything, to clear up all the misunderstandings. Even if she couldn't forgive him or choose to be with him, he couldn't bear the thought of her moving on with someone else so soon. But he was too late. No matter how long he pressed the doorbell, the apartment remained silent, devoid of any sound. Refusing to accept it, he called out her name, his voice desperate. "Gracie, it's me." A soft click sounded behind him. A neighbor had stepped out, unable to ignore the commotion any longer. The man looked at Victor and said, "Sir, please stop making noise. No one lives there anymore." Victor froze. "They went out." The neighbor shook his head. "No, they moved out. Just left recently. Said they were going on a honeymoon trip with her fiancé. Didn't you know?" Before the neighbor could finish his sentence, Victor had already taken off, disappearing like a gust of wind. He drove straight to the nearest airport, calling Grace over and over on the way. Each time the line rang until the automated message came on, but she never picked up. Then his assistant James called. "Mr. Victor, Miss Lily owed significant debts from online loans. I just escorted her back to the country, but as soon as we landed, her creditors took her away." Victor said nothing, his grip on the steering wheel tightening until his knuckles turned white. His car sped down the road, but for the first time he felt utterly powerless. The truth had come too late, and the person he cared about most might already be beyond his reach. Victor couldn't care less about Lily. Gritting his teeth, he barked, "Send someone to every airport nearby. I don't care if you have to turn the entire area upside down. Just make sure Grace doesn't get away." "Yes, sir." "Oh, and one more thing." Victor suddenly remembered something. When Grace flew from home to Milan, her boarding information had been completely untraceable. She might not be using her real name. She has a Singaporean passport. Check for her English name, Jane Sue. "Got it. I'll get right on it." But 3 days passed, and despite deploying every resource he had, Victor still found no trace of Grace. This time her disappearance was even more complete than the last. Victor hadn't slept, eaten, or rested for the entirety of those 3 days, and word of his condition eventually reached Oliver. Worried Oliver called to check in. "Victor." Before he could say more, Victor's urgent voice cut in. "Is there any news about Gracie?" "I know it's not about her, it's you. You can't keep going like this," Oliver said gently. "I don't know what happened between the two of you, but she's right about one thing. She's an adult and she has the right to decide her own future." Sitting in a pitch-black room, Victor listened in silence. He took in every word, clear as day, but he simply couldn't bring himself to accept them. This time, Grace had left with such finality that even Oliver didn't know where she had gone. She wasn't going to give him another chance. Meanwhile, at a quaint little courtyard house in the countryside, Grace was lounging in a rocking chair, soaking up the rare autumn sunlight. Days like this were becoming scarce as the season deepened. Seth, busy cleaning his camera equipment nearby, noticed her serene expression. Thinking she was asleep, he quietly picked up his camera and snapped a photo. Grace's sharp ears caught the sound of the shutter in an instant. She sat up, turned to him and said, "Let me see that. If you made me look bad, you're in big trouble." "Here." Seth handed her the camera. Grace inspected the photo and finally broke into a smile. "Not bad. You've got skills. I'll forgive you." Seeing her in a good mood, Seth couldn't help but smile too. "Don't forget, I'm also one of Oliver's students. And technically, I'm your senior." The two of them joked and laughed for a while. Then, as an autumn breeze swept through the courtyard, Seth suddenly remembered something. "Oh, I spoke to Oliver today. He said your brother is practically turning all of Europe upside down looking for you. He's not going to stop anytime soon and—" He trailed off, watching Grace's expression carefully. When he saw her smile fade slightly, he continued, "Oliver also said your brother's not doing too well." Grace's tone was calm as she replied, "We're all adults now. Everyone has to learn to live their own life. That's his choice." Her gaze shifted to the vibrant autumn-hued hillside in the distance. Then she turned to Seth and said, "Hey, I'm thinking of packing up and heading to the mountains to photograph the autumn scenery. Want to come? Of course, Seth said without hesitation. Wherever you want to go, I'm in. Grace smiled again. I'm thinking about staying near the Alps for a while. How does that sound? Sounds good to me. Seth immediately got up. I'll go pack for both of us. You can take another nap. I'll let you know when everything's ready. As the two planned their next adventure, Victor sat alone in his dark room, flipping through the files in his hands. The only light in the room came from a single wall lamp, casting shadows over his face, making him look like a vampire brooding in an old castle. James knocked on the door cautiously before stepping in to report. Mr. Victor, as per your instructions, we've found a few new candidates who meet the requirements. Victor finally spoke. Bring them in. James, ever wary of Victor's volatile mood, quickly placed the files on the table and stepped back. But Victor showed little interest in the documents, as if the profiles before him were completely irrelevant to what he had asked for. Just as James began to grow more anxious, Victor suddenly lit a cigarette. His gaze froze on one particular file, and he stared at it for what felt like an eternity. The cigarette burned dangerously close to his fingers before he snapped out of his trance and flicked it away. It fell onto the couch, nearly scorching a hole into the fabric. James jumped, startled. Mr. Victor. Victor seemed to wake from a dream. He picked up the cigarette and extinguished it in the ashtray. He pulled out the file he had been fixated on and handed it to James. Her. Give her some money and send her off to do whatever she wants. The photo on the file showed a young woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to Grace, almost a perfect match. James hesitated, confused. Shouldn't we bring her here? Victor's brows furrowed. What do you mean by that? After the initial despair subsided, he stopped frantically scouring every corner for Grace's whereabouts. Instead, he adopted a different kind of madness, instructing his people to search for girls who resembled Grace in both appearance and age. James, his assistant, initially thought Victor couldn't handle the reality of losing Grace, and was looking for a surrogate to fill the void. But now it seemed he had entirely misjudged the situation. Victor caught the hesitant glance of his assistant, his eyes hollow as he gazed into an empty void ahead. His voice, faint and distant, echoed like a ghost's murmur. I know what you're all thinking, but no one can replace her. Once she's gone, she's gone. From that day onward, Victor showed no signs of recovery. On the contrary, his self-destructive behavior intensified. He refused to eat or sleep. When exhaustion reached its peak, he'd collapse into a brief, unconscious slumber. During his waking hours, which barely resembled true consciousness, his actions were no less troubling. He smoked incessantly, as if trying to find an outlet for his inner torment through the suffocating haze of nicotine. James, being one of the few close to Victor, felt compelled to intervene. Summoning all his courage, he urged, Mr. Victor, I understand how much you're hurting, but life has to go on. Forgive my bluntness, but if you continue this cycle of sleepless nights and relentless smoking, I fear that long before we hear any news of Miss Grace, you'll collapse from illness. Victor's response was chillingly indifferent. That would be fine. He couldn't bear to close his eyes anymore. Each time he did, he was haunted by visions of Grace's cold, reproachful stare, her resolute figure walking away from him. In a voice tinged with bitter self-mockery, he asked, If I were dying, do you think she'd visit me just once? His longing for Grace consumed him, a yearning so deep it left no room for anything else. His mind was a battlefield, incapable of focus, his life a hollow shell. James dared not say more. Instead, he cautiously offered an alternative. Perhaps we should hire a private investigator to search for her again? There's no record of her leaving Europe. She must still be somewhere on the continent. Maybe she's just traveling. Victor's heart wavered at the suggestion, but after a moment he replied hoarsely, That won't be necessary. She's determined to avoid me. Even if I were to find her, all I'd face is her cold disdain. Besides, do I even have the right to see her? Everything that had happened was his own doing. If only he'd trusted her just a little more, things wouldn't have reached this point. Time, they say, is the best healer. A year later, on Christmas Eve, Victor returned to Grace's former residence for the first time since coming back to the country. Per his orders, the house had been meticulously maintained. Not a single trinket was out of place. Every corner of the room bore traces of her presence, as if Grace had just stepped out moments ago. Victor had given the housekeeper the day off and picked up the cleaning tools himself. He wanted to tidy up the room for her, as if it might bring him closer to her memory. That was when the letter arrived. The courier had already left, leaving only the handwriting on the envelope to hint at the sender. Victor chased after the courier in vain, failing to get any answers. Defeated, he returned to the room and opened the envelope. The contents were simple, just a postcard with the words, "Merry Christmas," printed on it. It was then that Victor realized Christmas was only 2 days away. In past years, no matter what happened, he and Grace always spent Christmas together. But starting last year, it had been just him. James arrived at that moment, delivering the cleaning supplies Victor had requested. Seeing Victor standing motionless at the doorway, staring at the postcard, James hesitated to interrupt. He chose instead to wait silently nearby. Only when Victor finally stirred did James venture to ask cautiously, "Mr. Victor, is this from Gracie?" Victor held the letter and the accompanying photograph with a touch so delicate it seemed he feared they might shatter. From where James stood, he could clearly see the photo's contents. Grace, dressed in a Santa Claus costume, standing intimately beside Seth. The two of them were posing playfully in front of a Christmas tree, their faces animated with exaggerated expressions. Though both were pulling silly faces, they exuded a warmth and liveliness that was undeniable. James's heart sank. This could only end badly. Victor was bound to take this hard. As this thought crossed James's mind, he grew increasingly cautious, not daring to speak further for fear of saying the wrong thing. And yet, Victor's demeanor was startlingly calm. "She said she's doing well now," Victor murmured, his voice a mix of sorrow and resignation. "She said she was once lost, desperate, even on the verge of giving up entirely. But then Seth appeared. He gave her hope and the strength to keep going." As Victor spoke, it was unclear whether he was relaying Grace's words to James or trying to convince himself. "She's happy now. The last thing she needs is me disrupting her life." But as he continued, his voice began to tremble. A year had passed. He had thought he had moved on. He had been wrong. "Would you like to sit down while you read, sir?" James asked, his tone filled with concern. Victor suddenly realized he had been standing for an indeterminate amount of time. He reached out to steady himself against the edge of the table, his movements stiff and mechanical as he sank onto the sofa. His back pressed against the cushions as if the weight of his grief had drained him of all strength. "Gracie also said that she hopes I can walk out of the shadows of the past soon, to find my own happiness instead of imprisoning myself in a cage of my own making. She really still sees me as her brother." Victor stared at Grace's photograph, wanting to smile at her, but no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't. In the end, all he could do was lift a hand to cover his face, hiding every trace of his emotions. His assistant, James, worried that Victor might spiral back into the state he was in a year ago, racked his brain for a solution. "Vic, just give me the address. It'll only take 10 minutes to confirm Grace's whereabouts. Even if she's already left, at least we'll know where she's gone." It was the best suggestion James could come up with. For a fleeting moment, Victor's heart wavered. He raised his hand as if ready to instruct James to take action. But in the end, he shook his head and lowered his hand, reaching instead for the photograph once more. "No need," he said quietly. his voice steady but hollow. She's already living the life she wants. I'm fine, really. I'm fine. After those words, Victor looked up at James, the assistant who had been by his side for so many years. Go home and spend Christmas with your family. Take it as a holiday. James didn't argue further. He packed up his things and left the room, a space heavy with the memories Victor and Grace once shared. Victor remained seated, unmoving for what felt like an eternity. Time blurred around him. For a moment, he thought he saw Grace pushing the door open, her familiar presence filling the room, but it was only an illusion. His hand lingered over the familiar handwriting on the card, tracing every stroke of her words. She had written, "Merry Christmas, brother." He didn't know how much time had passed before he finally reached for pen and paper. Slowly, deliberately, he wrote a simple reply. "Congratulations on your wedding, sister." The end.